common practice back in the 1990s to take a famous film and rework it into an animated series. This happened with the Ghostbusters, the '98 Godzilla film, and even Rambo. I am not joking about that. In this video, we're gonna take a look at what happens when you animate the Highlander.
I know there are a lot of polarizing views regarding Highlander, the animated series, and I agree with a few of them too, but it remains a very fond memory from my childhood days. Back then, I did not really know much about the larger franchise and would simply stick to cartoons and other animated stuff on my family's TV. I periodically go back to some of these shows as an adult, and now I am well acquainted with the franchise. So, of course, I have my own opinions regarding it. But is it really completely fair to judge something solely by comparison? In that way, even something as well made as the Lord of the Rings movie trilogy would fall flat on its face because the books are so much better. So today, I am not necessarily going to just list out everything that went wrong with this show. It was not perfect, sure, but I know a lot of you will agree with me that it forms a quiet, happy part of your childhood. Let's go back to that first, and then we can talk about it in a more critical tone. How is the series different from the broader Highlander franchise? So before I go into the details of the show, because maybe it's new to a few of you who have only watched the movies, it really is important to know that this series is really not similar to them in most aspects. Firstly, this was intended for younger audiences, so obviously there was a lot of stuff it simply could not borrow directly from the franchise. The premise was quite ambitious, because it took on the beloved cult film and projected it a whole 700 years into a post-apocalyptic future. I guess they wanted to have a dystopian setting to enhance the world building and keep the classic Highlander mythos involved in some way. This was not exactly successful, because people who watched it with the expectation that it would be better than the film were all sorely disappointed. But there were also a few like me, to whom the series was the very entry point to Highlander. And hey, I was a kid, so any kind of action was good enough for me back then. The makers of Highlander, the animated series, intended for it to be a mix of sequel and a creative reinterpretation. Like most other stories in the post-apocalyptic trope, the show was based on the fact that the world had undergone complete devastation in the wake of a meteorite collision, which forced the immortals to swear off the game and become Jeditors instead. Essentially, they saw the cataclysmic event as a call to abandon the endless game and instead preserve humanity as the keepers of human knowledge by giving up their identities as warriors. Of course, there is always that one guy who doesn't agree to things and ruins it for everyone. In this show, the immortal Corten refuses to accept this oath and becomes a tyrant. He builds a fortress at Magonda and basically rules over the world from there. This was a slightly watered-down explanation to get kids hooked on the show, because a tyrant and/or evil person is automatically a black and white villain for most people. But for those of you who are fans of Highlander, you'll realize that Corten actually embodies the old Highlander ideal twisted into obsession, the pursuit of the prize not for any kind of freedom, but for control. And a significant point of departure from the films is the fact that the other immortals here can willingly transfer their accumulated knowledge and power, their quickening, without actually being killed. Doing this only strips them of their immortality, but doesn't otherwise harm them in any way. This totally changes the rules because the protagonist, Quentin MacLeod, does not have to behead the Jeditors to gain their power and knowledge. Corten, however, sticks to the old ways and would behead his enemies. The Jeditors were sworn to their oath, so anyone who broke the same was destined to die, making Corten almost invincible because none of the other Jeditors could try to bring him down meaningfully without signing off on their own death sentence. Quentin was prophesied to be the immortal and the last of the MacLeods, who would be able to defeat Corten for good. The basic theme was about good versus evil and how the former always triumphs. But most of the characters were more than just black and white heroes and villains. If you've watched it, you remember how some of Corten's henchmen were shown to have a conscience at times, and even Quentin was at times tempted by greed and power. Sometimes, even the Jeditors would use a loophole in their oath and not engage Corten directly, but instead use proxies, or by changing their names. Ultimately, the good side always won, but the show was certainly distinctive because it didn't shy away from violence and murder despite being intended for kids. I remember how someone would die in pretty much every episode, And while the scenes were not exactly graphic, I wasn't used to seeing that much death in any other show at the time. Funny enough, a few of my friends' parents had gotten quite incensed about this fact back then and had forbidden them to watch the series, but they would sneak into my house to get their fill. Anyway, that's pretty much all you need to know about the background of the show and its central lore. Let's move on to the episodes. Here's how Season 1 set the groundwork for Quentin's development. So this series ran for 2 seasons, from 1994 to 1996, with around 40 episodes in all. I'm not going to recap every episode, of course, because then we would be stuck here for days. And a few episodes were also sort of fillerish and weird, if that makes any sense. Like, they did not meaningfully add anything to the plot beyond the whole transferring of power and knowledge to defeat Cortin. The first season was more about the moral and physical development of Quentin MacLeod as he struggled to reconcile with his fate of being the last of his clan, as well as the one destined to defeat the tyrant. He had to prove himself worthy of the trust and admiration of each Jeditor before he could gain their power, so thankfully, it wasn't completely one-dimensional in the way that he was regarded as some kind of messiah figure by them. In the pilot, Quentin was living a quiet life in the Highlands as part of the Dundee clan with his mother and adoptive sister Clyde. However, when Cortin's hunters raid his village, he watches his mother die before him helplessly, and he himself is killed in the struggle. At that point, he had no idea of his real identity. So when his death triggered his immortality, his dying mother revealed his true lineage as Quentin MacLeod, the prophesized future Highlander. Don Vicente Marino Ramirez was then introduced as a Jeditor who had been waiting for 700 years for Quentin's arrival, and he took it upon himself to train the young boy into becoming worthy of his destiny. He explained the oath to Quentin, and explained how immortals have abandoned the game to protect humanity's fragile remnants so none of them can defeat Cortin. Against Ramirez's warning, Quentin raced to save the people of his clan who were imprisoned by the villain and pay the price for his impulsivity by causing the death of Mangus, a Jeditor who sacrificed himself so that the boy and Ramirez could get away from Cortin. It was a little jarring to see so many deaths in the first episode itself, but it did cement the fact that this was not going to be a comfortable show. Like most protagonists who had to accept their fates without being prepared, it also realistically depicted how Quentin was far from ready to take on someone as powerful as Cortin and had to witness other people take the fall for his decisions. The second episode focused on Ramirez taking Quentin to meet another Jeditor named Stevenson, who was a master of hydroelectrics. The irony that someone who embodied that kind of wisdom ended up betraying that trust stuck with me. Stevenson's fear-driven betrayal was once again a very realistic way to show that people who might appear just on the surface are often cowards. I mean, I did not think all this back then, but when I rewatch it now, I often understand more that my 10-year-old self had missed out on. Episode 3, titled The Last Weapon, was where Quentin came across a very deadly weapon and almost became tempted by its power, and only realized how harmful losing control can be when he accidentally injured his younger sister with it. This episode was also a nod to 20th century warfare. We hear about Connor MacLeod for the first time in episode 5, titled The Sound of Madness. It is not explicitly mentioned whether Quentin is a direct descendant of Connor because his father's identity was never revealed, and even his mother did not really have any screen time. I always figured that Quentin was hidden among the Dundies so that he would be as far away from trouble as possible until it was time for him to step up and take charge of his fate. In episode 6, a Jeditor named Olak is introduced, who is unsure about transferring his quickening to Quentin. It is also revealed that our protagonist had a deadly fear of heights, and since he was unable to overcome it, it led to an innocent man's capture. However, Quentin made up for it through his bravery, which prompted Olak to finally consider the boy worthy. What really impressed me about this particular episode was how Olak felt free and overjoyed after having lost his immortality. In the Highlander franchise, losing one's quickening can never really be something akin to relief, but this show worked on a much more mature take to portray that immortality only sounds good on paper. Episode 11, Fallout, hits a little close to home with its depiction of the destructive aftermath of nuclear war. Ramirez and Quentin journey to a desert that used to be a lush garden before it was destroyed by an atomic bomb, and the inhabitants have developed mutations like webbed hands and blue skin. There, the Jeditor with knowledge of the atom, Prometheus, was introduced, and it was a cruel joke how he himself had fallen prey to radiation. He was eager to let go of his immortality too, because his very existence had become extremely painful. But Quentin was reluctant to take on his quickening because he was afraid of ending up the same way. However, when Cortin wanted to take it himself, Quentin stepped up and did his duty, but vowed never to pass it on to anyone else. This episode also featured a flashback to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki during the Second World War. Now that I think about it, the mid-1990s were about promoting nuclear disarmament and peace since the USSR no longer existed, so the people behind the show were certainly trying to send a powerful message using this episode. Courage of Love, the next episode, showed slightly more disturbing themes when Iraq, one of the generals of Corten, kidnapped a woman from the hometown of Brana, a Jeditor who was his lover too. Of course, to younger viewers, it might seem somewhat ordinary for tyrants to capture people, but the fact that only a woman was taken, unlike the first episode where the entire Dundee tribe was imprisoned, certainly was a much darker implication. Brana was also shown as a pretty cowardly man who stood behind his oath and did nothing to help until much later, and then he shared his quickening with Quentin to live the rest of his days with the woman he loved. The final episode of the first season is one of my favorites, because it showed our protagonist being challenged in the real sense via manipulation. Ramirez and Quentin traveled to meet Yoshoda, one of the most powerful Jeditors, who did not trust Quentin's capabilities enough. They met a strange young man who almost managed to convince Quentin to forsake his goal and become a warlord. Ultimately, this was revealed to be a test by Yoshoda, who wanted to see if the boy would become a tyrant like Corten if given power. Coming to Season 2, with higher stakes. The first season was Quentin's development arc. The second one was where his destiny started to manifest properly. Right off the bat, Episode 1 of Season 2 showed Quentin dealing with horrendous nightmares, as a result of which his impulsivity got the better of him once more, and he went off to kill Corten all by himself. It also showed that Corten had killed Connor in the past and planned to do the same to Quentin, ending the MacLeod line for good. In The Eye of Heaven, another immortal named Shepard is introduced, who also never took the oath, just like Corten. However, he did it out of shame and not greed, because he blamed himself for the near destruction of the world. He initially challenged Quentin to behead him and take his quickening, but was swayed by Ramirez to swear the oath and transfer it to Quentin instead. In Episode 4, titled The Treasure in the Sand, we once again see the recurring theme of slavery when Clyde gets abducted. However, she discovers a library with countless books, but under Corten's orders, all books are to be destroyed. This reminds Ramirez of the burning of books in the New World by the Spanish conquistadors. The treasure in the title refers to knowledge, and it is also a nod to how books were destroyed by the Nazi regime during the Second World War. In the secret prison, Ramirez and Quentin come across a booby-trapped labyrinth where prisoners are held and worship the Almighty K, aka Corten himself. The prisoners have never seen the light of day and are all trained to be hunters from birth. It is revealed that Iraq was born in that prison itself, and efforts are made to liberate the prisoners both mentally and physically. While Corten does his best to stop them from escaping, Iraq himself steps up and helps them see the outside world for the first time as they get their freedom. In the next episode, Dead Ringer, a trap is planned for Ramirez and Quentin, which apparently fails. But the former then starts acting extremely out of character and tells Quentin he is ready to face Corten. He even slaps Clyde when she insists that Quentin would be walking to his death, so the abrupt change in behavior makes everyone quite worried. It is later revealed that this Ramirez was a doppelganger, and the real one was captured so that Quentin would be tricked into facing off against Corten. If you remember the episode Fallout from the first season that I just discussed a while back, the Jeditor Prometheus was mentioned to be the one with knowledge of the atom. However, in Season 2, we come across another Jeditor named Volta, who is the master of nuclear power. I am still a little confused here because nuclear energy is basically the same as atomic energy, so these two disciplines shouldn't really be different enough to justify two different Jeditors. It's not really addressed in the show, so I'm hoping someone can help me understand the distinction in the comments below, because unfortunately, I am not well versed in physics. Episode 15 of Season 2, titled The Survivors from Outer Space, is a really interesting one, as it features a NASA space shuttle that was launched before the apocalypse and was supposed to return to Earth after 30 years of space exploration. However, their hypersleep lasted too long, and they arrived back almost 700 years too late. Quite conveniently, one of the three people on board was the immortal Emerson, Cortan's protege from way back. Irina and Stevenson, the other two members, were betrayed by Emerson, who stole the shuttle and took credit for the discovery of an invisibility gas. In turn, he gets betrayed by Corten, who uses the gas on himself and kills Emerson in order to kill Quentin. Another interesting episode is The Cult of the Immortal, where Quentin and Ramirez discover a mining village that acts as a death cult and worships the immortal god, Quentin MacLeod. When children are about to be sacrificed to him, many people protest, and once they finally see Quentin in the face, they wish to kill him. With Ramirez in tow, he meets the leader of the rebellion named Marjorie and explains how Quentin is neither a god nor someone who demands sacrifices. It all turns out to be a plan by Corten, who wants to get rid of Quentin. Finally, the cult is defeated and Quentin's obnoxious idol is destroyed. In episode 25, a cyborg enters Moganda to kill Corten, while Ramirez takes Quentin to meet Matsuda, the cybernetics janitor who had lost his hand to Corten. It was Matsuda who used a cyborg to attack Corten, because technically, he would not be breaking his oath in that case. Later, he transfers his quickening to Quentin. However, he does get into a quarrel with Ramirez, who believes that Matsuda still broke his oath, even though he himself did not attack Corten. Why was the finale anticlimactic? The final episode, titled Countdown, had a lot of expectation hinging on it, but ultimately it was not impressive enough. Even as a kid, I was really disappointed by how the show ended, because you don't really expect children to understand open endings. The episode begins with a missile base being set in operation by Corten, who starts to indiscriminately fire in every direction, causing mass chaos. Arak announces that the bombing will end on only one condition: if the people give up the Highlander and make him surrender to Corten within just 12 hours. Desperate to save themselves, many people start to hunt Quentin down and attribute all the destruction to him. However, the Dundee clan comes to his aid and helps him. Ramirez and Quentin realize that the time has come and break into the base to disarm the machinery as well as to finish Corten for good. They manage to set a self-destruct sequence that would wipe out the base, but before he can leave, Quentin encounters Corten. They duel as the countdown begins, and even Corten's henchmen start escaping the base in droves. Corten finally manages to knock Quentin's sword out of his hand and goes in for the killing blow. Just then, the countdown ends and the base explodes. The fire from the explosion engulfs Corten right when he is about to strike. Ramirez and Clyde watch from afar as they break down over the fact that Quentin could not make it out of the base on time. The scene shifts back to the base, and Quentin emerges from the rubble, almost unharmed. He looks at Corten, who appears to be passed out, and takes his sword away. Just as he turns, Corten's fingers move ever so slightly. Quentin meets up with his sister and mentor, and they are all overjoyed at his safe return. The villagers who had earlier turned against him now ask him for forgiveness, and Quentin readily gives it. The final scene shows him, Ramirez, and Clyde riding into the sunset. And that's it. That's how Highlander the animated series ends. All the build-up for 39 episodes, just to get a 4-minute fight sequence between Quentin and Corten that doesn't even end in a satisfactory way. It just seemed very rushed and poorly written, which is a shame, because the rest of the show is really not that bad. I was expecting a grand one-on-one between the hero and the villain, and some good closure with Corten dying and Quentin avenging Connor and the other immortals. Even in what we got, Quentin basically was disarmed very easily and would have been toast if the base had not exploded. And about that, how is it that the fire took out Corten but didn't harm Quentin at all? I wasn't expecting him to just come out of the rubble looking all fresh. It would have at least made more sense if both of them died during the explosion and Ramirez adopted Clyde at the end. In the end, all the training and quickening accumulation did not really amount to much, because Quentin was clearly not at Corten's level and just got lucky. Not to mention, I cannot say that Corten died for certain either, because we saw him twitching his fingers as Quentin ran away. And all the world building about how he had become a tyrant and oppressed the world for years. That idea is also completely discarded, because what happened to the world after Corten seemingly died? Quentin and Ramirez just ride into the sunset, but what if someone else steps up to take Corten's place as an oppressor? It was a very disappointing way to end the series because it just didn't feel satisfying at all. And I know I'm not the only one who thinks that way, because I'm going to talk about critical reception in just a while. Understanding the central characters. Despite the unsatisfying ending, most of the characters in Highlander the animated series were actually quite well written. Quentin's fate was pretty bleh, with a tiny fight scene with Corten where he doesn't even get to kill the man himself, but otherwise, his character development throughout the 40 episodes is noticeable. What makes Quentin a likable and compelling character among the franchise's protagonists is the fact that he learns morality the hard way. He doesn't just fight his way out and through the unique quickening mechanism in the show. Immortals willingly share knowledge and wisdom rather than beheading one another. This interpretation focuses more on mentorship instead of just sticking to outright violence. With each episode, we clearly see Quentin changing from an impulsive, reactive young man to a principled immortal who understands that fighting Cortan is not just about bringing down a tyrant. It's also important to reclaim knowledge and use power for the good of others, because, in the wrong hands, knowledge can become a dangerous tool that can oppress those who are less able. On IMDb, many reviews have noted that the show purposely moved everything to a dystopian world so that the showrunners could have as much creative freedom as they wanted, which is why the concepts are so different from the rest of the franchise. The main reason for this was to make Quentin's storyline more educational rather than only combat-driven. An approach like this made the show suitable for children without giving up totally on the concept of Highlander. However, this was also why the show had been criticized for being overtly kid-friendly. The producers probably intended to combine adult franchise lore with the kind of storytelling kids find appealing, and opinions vary widely on how successfully it did that. Ramirez, Quentin's mentor, personifies the moral theme of the series. His character executes the idea of knowledge versus power. His job is to steer Quentin toward wisdom and patience, rather than simply following blind violence. Many episodes use flashbacks to his earlier life, portraying that immortality without purpose is in itself a kind of suffering. I think this is also a little consistent with the broader Highlander mythology, where immortality often ends up being the very reason for death. Despite this, the show barely reaches the complexity of the live-action Highlander universe. While the concept of immortals giving up the game was fascinating and ambitious, and even audacious at some point out, the execution sometimes felt hasty and vague, as the world's rules were not clear at all, especially in the early episodes. Clyde of Dundee, Quentin's adoptive sister, is one of my most adored characters in the show. Despite the fact that she is not an immortal and, in fact, often causes many disruptions, her character adds a sense of grounding, a human touch that we rarely see in such superhero-esque stories. She might be young, but she demonstrates a lot of courage at times. Her childlike curiosity, banter, and fear remind us of the greater theme of the show, that humanity needs to be protected. Many fans have praised Clyde for adding a touch of humor and wonder to the show, and for her dedication towards her brother. Coming to the antagonists, Cortan is mostly a straight-out bad guy. He refused to take the oath because he wanted nothing but power, and thought it foolish to give it up just for the sake of humanity. He is a foil to Quentin's moral evolution that happens throughout the show, because while Quentin accumulates wisdom, Cortan only seeks power. He does not care about knowledge beyond what it serves him, and has no problem using the Jeditor's oath against them. He is a typical post-apocalyptic dictator, suited well enough for a children's show. He doesn't embody the nuanced backstories of characters from the original franchise, which is why fans are often dismissive of him. Other supporting villains such as Arak, Asclepios, and Malone are only memorable at a surface level. Other than Arak, they did not really get much backstory and are very one-dimensional. Cortan is the big bad, and they mostly just act as sidekicks who execute his orders. Lastly, the Jeditors reflect the most lore-rich addition to the animated series. Characters like Mangus, Yoshoda, and others each have complete control over a domain of knowledge, such as architecture, martial arts, and nuclear power. And I like how this idea changes what we typically understand as immortality. Basically, instead of engaging in endless combat for the prize, the definition of immortality becomes something that serves as a tool to help humanity. But this is one of the most polarizing aspects of the series among fans. A lot of them have said that this deviation diluted the franchise by replacing head-to-head conflict with very watered-down moral lessons. I kinda agree, to an extent. Because while it was needed to reduce the violence to make it suitable for kids, the overt focus on wisdom and knowledge did make it boring in some episodes. Why was the initial reception so cold? If you check IMDb, you will see that the aggregated user score sits at 6.3 out of 10 from over 700 reviews. This points to a slightly lukewarm fan reception rather than either overwhelming praise or outright criticism. Essentially, it's an average, mediocre work that had the potential to become great, but unfortunately did not. The showrunners wanted to capitalize on the fame of the Highlander franchise and, in the process, set certain expectations that were just not met. It was like a child-friendly version of Highlander, which lacked depth because it was marketed towards a specific group. Some viewers have appreciated the distinct reimagining, while others have felt that it simplifies or even betrays the core idea of the franchise. If you look across fan forums and discussions, the reviews for Highlander, the animated series, are mostly either nostalgic or disappointing. Like me, there are a few for whom the post-apocalyptic setting, lighthearted storyline, and peculiar character designs left a lasting impression. But I also agree that the narrative and continuity problems were sometimes difficult to ignore, especially for people who were already acquainted with Highlander. You can say that the series is loved for what it was, a creative animated offshoot. At the same time, it is also rightfully criticized for what it desperately tried to be, a complete reimagination for younger audiences. Where exactly did things go wrong? Honestly, making it family-friendly is where the show lost most seasoned Highlander fans. Doing this did not really reflect just how serious the stakes were, and at times, the characters just ended up being silly and funny instead of educational. The premise was ambitious, but after the first season ended, the writing lost its way, and Season 2 was extremely confusing at times. With more than double the number of episodes in the first season, the show dragged minor issues like the ones portrayed in Dead Ringer and Cult of the Immortal, for instance. If those had been condensed and more time had been dedicated to the final episode where Quentin actually faced Cortan, it would have still been a better series overall. The finale was the last nail in the coffin, because it let people down who still enjoy the show despite its differences from the franchise. It felt like all the character development was for nothing when Quentin was so easily disarmed by Cortan and would have died a really silly death had it not been for the fire. I am not exactly sure why there was such a drag in the middle of the season and then a mad rush to finish the series somehow, but had that not been the case, the reviews would have been definitely much better. Highlander, the animated series, is not on par with many other shows, but it remains one of the earliest animated adaptations of a major fantasy franchise with a completely different lore and setting. It has been decades since it was aired on TV, yet many fans remember it with a fondness because it represents a simpler time for all of us. Most importantly, the concept of the Jeditors remains a very interesting addition to the franchise's lore, which could have been explained in a much better manner. Fans often discuss what the larger Highlander story could have been like with a little less violence and a greater emphasis on philosophy. Ultimately, all of it was a creative gamble that could have gone either way. So it's not entirely bad that the series lands somewhere in the middle.